We're live. Welcome to another round of, it's not even the Real Meal Revolution podcast anymore. It's just the Facebook Live. We have clinical psychologist Victoria Webster with us. Victoria runs the eating psychology workshops every week at the Real Meal Revolution for anyone who's on the online course and the Hero program and the coaching program. And today she is here to talk to us about a lecture that she ran last week or this week.
Last week.
Boundaries. And you might think, what do boundaries have anything to do with eating? And Victoria is going to tell us. Victoria, welcome. What are boundaries?
So boundaries are really, really important. They are the limits that we kind of set for ourselves. So what our beliefs are, what our values are, what we're willing to do, what we're not willing to do. So they're incredibly important in relationships. If we don't have good boundaries, then it's very easy to get mixed up in unhealthy relationships. So yeah, they're basically our limits, our personal limits.
So what is an example of a boundary that could damage a relationship, or how could it damage a relationship?
So for example, if I don't have any boundaries around my emotions, my partner has no boundaries, so we're both kind of just feeding off of each other's emotions all the time. If my partner is feeling down or sad, I will be feeling down or sad. There'll be no separation between the two of us. If he's angry with me, my sense of self-worth and who I am will be based on that he's angry with me. I won't be able to kind of have that on my own. So we can get very mixed up with other people if we're not clear on our boundaries.
So in that context, is a boundary literally like a separation?
Well, it's not tangible. It's an emotional kind of, but it is. It's a separation between you and the other person.
Yeah. How does that relate to codependence?
Yeah, it's very much related. People in a codependent relationship are far too invested in one another that they cannot do things independent of each other. So a very similar thing. Everything depends on the other person. They can't make decisions without the other person. And so two people like that will sometimes stay in a very toxic relationship because they can't function without one another. So their lives will actually be falling apart and it'll be very difficult, but they'll stay there because they're just so interlinked. Yeah.
Crazy. And what has that got to do with eating?
It's got a lot to do with eating. Your personal boundaries are really a reflection of your boundaries with eating. If in relationships, you're the kind of person that's very passive, struggles to say what you need, can't say no, maybe you're always feeling like you have to please everybody. When it comes to a situation where you've got to be clear about what you want to eat and your food, you're not going to be able to do it in an effective way. So the two, it's all areas of your life. Your personal boundaries are going to be reflected, like in your eating as well. So if you want to have a good look at, if you're struggling with boundaries, a good place to start is looking at your personal boundaries and having a look at your relationships and seeing what's really going on. It'll give you a good idea.
So what is maybe you could tell us what a healthy boundary looks like and then what an unhealthy boundary looks like. Or I suppose it wouldn't be like an unhealthy boundary, like no boundary or the absence.
Yeah. So they're kind of three types of boundaries. There's very loose, blurry boundaries, which can sometimes be okay in some situations, but those are usually the ones where people can easily step over your boundary and it's not set. You get very rigid boundaries, which are okay in some situations as well. Like, for example, if somebody grabs your bag, a stranger grabs your bag, you're going to immediately know that that's not okay with you. That would be a rigid boundary. So those are okay, but sometimes they can get in the way. So a healthy boundary is really a boundary that is flexible and adaptable. So you're able to kind of take in information about what's going on around you and the context, and you're able to make a decision still based on your values and your beliefs and what's good for you, but still taking in what's around you. So a person with rigid boundaries, for example, might really struggle to take on feedback or get any kind of feedback from an employer or whatever the case is. But if you have a healthy boundary around that, you'll be able to consider. somebody else's point of view.
Can you explain that a little bit more, like receiving feedback, like how the boundary would limit your ability to digest feedback?
So if you have very black and white thinking around certain things, the way you do things is the way you do things, and there's no other way about it. A person like that would really struggle to hear that there's a different way to do something. It wouldn't be on the radar of what they can consider. Yeah. So then they would struggle to do things differently, or get feedback about doing things differently.
Got it. Now, one of the things that we have at Real Meal is there's this thing where we get women in particular who have had children and a career, and then they've spent like 20 years dealing with their children and like running the household and working. For some reason, like these husbands just like got let off the hook, and so what I call it is like diving on the grenade for everyone else. And then they're, and then obviously like they're the ones who have lost out and their bodies have taken a hit. And now they're sitting there and they're like, well, I did what I was supposed to do. I helped everyone, there just wasn't time for me. And they're like stuck in this people pleasing mindset. And it's very easy to say like, yeah, I did the right thing. But could you relate that to boundaries and where that is and isn't healthy?
Yeah, so someone like that, they've put their needs on the back burner. So eventually you kind of stop listening to what you need. And you definitely, when you're not listening to what you need, you're not asking for what you need either. So you kind of forget how to do that. Then suddenly it comes to you trying to look after yourself and your body. And it's very hard for you to know what you need and to express what you need. So you get stuck not being able to do those things. And usually a lot of the time, a person that puts their needs always last, they do end up feeling a bit resentful and a bit miserable. And they may not express that, but they may feel that way. So in terms of eating, a person like that is really, really going to struggle at the beginning to figure out the boundaries. Yeah. And that's really what boundaries are asking for what you need. And being able to reinforce that over and over again.
Yeah, so because we have that often where someone will join and they'll decide to change their eating, and then then no one else is interested. So said woman who's been diving on the grenade all of a sudden tries to set like a micro boundary, saying like, I'm just going to eat like my little healthy meal, and everyone's like, what are you doing? It's ridiculous, and they get their boundaries challenged. Like, why does that happen? Why would other people challenge your boundary if you're trying to be healthy?
Well, I think it's interesting because in relationships, we get stuck in dynamics. And when someone starts to do something different, it challenges the dynamic of the relationship. So like, I'm just thinking two friends where they always support each other. And the one friend's always saying to the other friend, like, nothing's your fault. You're a great person. You don't need to change anything. Like, it's all good. Suddenly, when that person starts to get their independence and put down boundaries, that friend is going to struggle to support them in the same way. And suddenly the dynamic changes. So I think relationships can feel like they're getting threatened when people start putting boundaries in place. And that's why people tend to push back on boundaries. Even people that are supporting us, they can feel threatened. They can be trying to help, but not knowing how to change. And
discomfort.
Discomfort. And when one person changes their behavior, the other person can't behave in the same way they were behaving. So it has an effect on another person as well.
And it's out of their control.
Yeah. And that can be uncomfortable. Yeah.
So that's why someone's like, I remember when I stopped drinking and everyone was so uncomfortable. In fact, my a big part of my family grilled me around the table, like at Christmas. I was sitting there, minding my own business, quitting drinking, and they were so uncomfortable. They were like, just have one glass. What's the big deal? Can't you just have a few drinks every now and then? Why have you got to be so hard line? I was like, guys, I'm not making anyone else do this. Just let me, and they wouldn't. It was like eventually I got up and I left. I was like, I want to go home. I'm sick of this holiday. Like, so it's because they felt very uncomfortable about it.
Yeah.
Is it part of them also having their own beliefs challenged?
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's also like this idea that certain food is good and certain food is bad. And so people have like a judgment. They've internalized that, and there's a judgment about food. If you eat a certain thing, you're good. If you eat a certain thing, you're bad. And so suddenly when you're challenging that whole system, it's hard for people, and they don't like it. Yeah. I have seen this play out thousands of times. So Me too.
So how does someone take Grenade Diver as an example? How do we take that person who's so used to helping and like finds it so uncomfortable asking for what they need? Like, how do you begin building boundaries or setting boundaries?
So I think it's little baby steps. The first thing I think is defining boundaries. So I think you need to know what it is you're willing to do and not willing to do. When you go to the dinner party, are you going to eat the dessert or not? These are kind of some decisions you can start to make beforehand, put boundaries in place. From there, you want to work on being more assertive. And there are little ways that you can start to practice being more assertive in your everyday life. A really good start is learning to say no, which a lot of people struggle with. But sometimes it can be just like a good experiment to try and see how it feels. And it's going to feel uncomfortable, but the more you do it, the easier it becomes. And there are a whole bunch of different little things you can do to be more assertive. Like it's recognizing your body language, sitting up straighter, looking at someone directly in the eye, trying to be more direct with what you have to say. There's another technique where you can actually script. You can actually write down how you're going to ask for what you need. And the idea of being assertive is that it's respectful. It's considering yourself. It's considering the other person. You're not trying to dominate someone or be aggressive. So there are a whole bunch of little techniques that you can start practicing to work on that and start setting some boundaries.
You said just now that you decide like what you are and aren't willing to do. And so my experience of this particular like realm is that in that person's mind, and I speak for myself as well in some areas, but the reason you have been diving on the grenade or putting others before yourself is because in your mind, you would rather do that than experience discomfort. And so when you think like, is it a problem for me to do X? You don't, it's like kind of trying to flex a muscle that doesn't really exist yet. So how do you decide what you are and aren't willing to do if you've been deciding in the past what you are and aren't willing to do, and you've decided that you're willing to do more than perhaps you should by strong mental health standards?
I guess it's taking some time to really figure out what your values are. I think goals are extremely important.
Okay, so like if this is the goal, like if this is the goal, then how would my behavior have to change? And then saying, okay, like this is actually what I need, and then practice laying boundaries down there.
Yeah.
Okay.
And your example of the women you're talking about, they probably wouldn't have a lot of goals because they're focused on everyone else's goals and everyone else's outcomes. So that's probably a very good place to start, is setting goals and then kind of working backwards. What do I need to change to get there?
Okay. And who needs to get out of my way?
Yeah, for sure.
So this is something that has happened a lot, where in fact there's this one client that I was working with, and she read Brené Brown's Daring Greatly, and then she all of a sudden realized like she had no boundaries, and she in fact had like 6 or 5 children, and all of a sudden just made this shift, and this was like she went in too hard almost, because she started like laying down boundaries. People were like, what the F is going on?
Yeah.
And so there was a massive pushback, and then there was like a 2-week period where she was like doubting herself, and it was either because she came across like too aggressive, but she had been too passive in the past, and she's trying to like figure out how how to actually like lay down the boundary without, obviously there's going to be upset and discomfort, as you said, but without being an asshole. So what, like you've mentioned passive and aggressive, and then there's passive aggression and there's assertiveness, like just can you unpack those terms a bit?
Yeah. So passive is kind of like you feel like you're on the back foot, like you kind of feel like you're not very deserving of what you're needing. You're trying to get it, but you don't know how to. It's a very indirect, roundabout kind of way of getting something. And so it's obviously quite ineffective. And usually a passive person doesn't end up getting what they need, and they end up feeling resentful and upset about it. Aggressive.
Do you have an example of that?
Passive.
Yeah.
Well, I'm trying to think. Well, wanting to change your lifestyle, wanting to eat healthy, but not putting down any boundaries. So just continuing in the same way, not doing anything differently. Maybe trying to have a conversation, but not doing it directly, or not really asking for what the person really needs.
Like, I'm really unhappy with my health right now. And then like not saying, I would really like your support in.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the person wouldn't know that, they can't read minds.
That sucks about marriage. Like, why can't people read minds?
Yeah. So aggressive is kind of the opposite. You're feeling like you want to, the other person's on the back foot, you're in control, you want to get your point across and kind of step on them to get there. So it's often quite direct expression of feelings, but it's usually like too threatening, or it's like a little bit inappropriate. And unfortunately, it does work to some extent sometimes, but usually it just ends up in relationships being quite damaged and people withdrawing from you. So it becomes ineffective. So that's aggression. Passive aggressive is doing things in a roundabout kind of way, but there's a little bit of a trying to hurt another person, trying to step on another person in a roundabout way. So like an example is like in the groups I run, if someone's being passive aggressive, you'll see them sitting in their chair with their arms folded and like their hoodie up, and they'll be like staring me down, but not saying anything. And they're trying to communicate something through in a very passive way. Another example of that is like if a client comes late for a session, it's a very passive, indirect way of saying like, I'm cross with you, or I don't respect your time, or whatever the case is. So it's an indirect communication that's quite sometimes like a jab or quite hurtful. And also incredibly ineffective in really trying to get what you need, as you can imagine. Yeah. And then assertive is a combination. It's kind of in the middle. So it's respecting the other person, respecting yourself, knowing what it is that you need, having a direct conversation. That's not aggressive and not passive. Yeah.
So we want to be assertive, not aggressive.
Yeah, definitely.
Is there like a handbook or like loose guide that you could say, like, give people? Is there a tool people can have for like, okay, I need to communicate this. I need to do it in an assertive way, but not passive and not aggressive. Like, are there rules or guidelines? Like
they are. I mean, there's actually, like I said, there's like a script. So it's like a 3-stage thing. So you define the situation that's pushing your boundaries. You express your feelings, and then you ask for what you need. And each sentence you start with a specific thing. So it goes, so that's describing the situation. When you tell me to eat the cake, then the next sentence is, I feel that you are not respecting me, or I feel uncomfortable. And then the last sentence is asking for what you need, which starts off with, I'm asking you if you could. And that would be like, so I'm asking you if you could stop pressuring me, and I'll eat the other food at the table. So there is a little script that you can actually follow and you can write down, and it's actually quite useful. And the more and more you practice it, the more and more you kind of use your own words. It becomes more authentic. It's not like reading off of a script. And that's a very helpful way of learning to be assertive.
And the idea with that is that you're obviously creating minimal conflict, because no one can really come back at you and say, well, some people do, like, don't feel that way. But in general, when you communicate your feelings, that's how, if someone's pissed off with you with how you feel, then that's kind of on them. Hey?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. But
so
but
when
I
you
find
X,
yeah, sorry.
when you X, I feel Y, and what I need is, or what I'd like from you, or what
I'm asking you, I'm
yeah,
wondering
I'm
if you
asking you.
could. Yeah. And there would be sometimes a time where you might say, I'm wondering if you could stop asking me, otherwise I'm going to leave, or otherwise I'm going to remove myself from the situation. Because there are times where things are more serious, and especially if someone's like shaming you about your eating, you might need to put down a firmer, more rigid boundary. But again, you have to be, it's context. You can't be going around saying that to everyone that offers you a piece of cake. You've got to kind of understand where it's coming from. Otherwise, you're not going to have any relationships at all.
Yeah, like you meet someone you've never met before, and they like offer you cake, and you're like, when you So and so on that note, like because ultimately this all comes down to the classic situation, like mother-in-law for dinner, or the party with people you don't know. How do you deal with a tough food situation where you don't feel like you have much of a choice?
So this is where some flexibility comes in. I think you've got to understand the context, and you may have to, and this is also where boundaries come in. So if I go to a dinner party and I know that eating the cake is going to set me on a spiral and I'm going to lose the plot, that needs to be a rigid boundary. And so even though it's going to be completely awkward and uncomfortable to say, sorry, I'm not going to have the cake to people I don't know, or my mother-in-law, whatever the case is, it's something I'm going to have to do because I've decided on that and I need to do that for myself. However, if that boundary is not super rigid and it's a little bit more flexible, I can make a very intentional decision about, I'm going to eat half the piece of cake, or I'm going to eat the piece of cake, but I'm going to understand why I've eaten it, and I'm going to then get back on track the next day. So it's kind of like weighing up being uncomfortable, not being uncomfortable. What's the best thing to do in that situation? I remember there was a time where I had super rigid boundaries around food, and I went to a course where we were learning to do mindfulness, and it was like a workshop with a whole bunch of people I didn't know. And one of the mindfulness little experiments we had to do was eat food and then be mindful of the texture and the taste and all of that stuff. And she had chuckles that she gave to all of us.
Because there's texture, and it's smooth, and it's crunchy.
Yeah. And I refused to eat. It was like 2 chuckles that we had to eat, and I refused to eat the chuckles. And I made quite a scene in a situation where, like, she was in control. The poor person that was facilitating, I mean, she didn't see this coming. It wasn't comfortable for everybody. Looking back at it now, I think I could have rethought that and maybe done that a little bit differently. I didn't need to cause all of that chaos in a situation. So that's what you've got to sort of think about. I think you talk about like the cost benefit of certain situations.
I was just thinking now, I call it a net positive or net negative. Yeah. So like that is a net negative where like, like 2 chuckles not going to kill you. Yeah. And if you back yourself to like not go on a spiral, then take the hit on the chuckle and like preserve the relationship. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I had a similar incident. It was actually, the example I used in that talk was actually related to a guy who just bought the rights to a very successful magazine, and he offered me a free copy. And I was like being all intentional about my reading and like, no, I only read one thing at a time and listen to it on Audible and read it in real life. And like, he was just saying like, here's a gift. It's my work. Like, this is my passion project. Yeah. And I was like, no, like, I don't want your work because it's going to give me clutter and I'm not going to read it and whatever. And then I thought about it at the end of it, and I was like, the guy just wanted me to take his work and appreciate like what he had done. And I was all like stuck in my boundaries. And I could have given it to someone else.
Yeah. That's exactly it. So there's context, there's adapting to a situation, being more flexible. So that's exactly it. Yeah.
Flip. That's fascinating. Okay. So very important. Okay. Anyone watching this, Victoria, it's like an amazing psychologist specializing. And now you're specializing in eating psychology. I know that there isn't like a real life specialization, but that's like where you specialize.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's it.
And your email address is in this post. So if you'd like to have a session with Victoria, I highly recommend it. And then she also runs the eating psychology workshops at Real Meal Revolution, which is what all of the online course participants get to participate in. And coming soon is the eating psychology program, where you can join and heal your relationship with food. So watch the space. Victoria, you are a flipping legend. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Jonno.
We'll have you back soon. I don't know what the next topic is, but I'm very excited. Thanks again.
Thank you.